Hello, and welcome to this iMesh course. So it is a course, essentially. It can be broken down into like 10 videos, I believe. And this time it's going to go from absolute basic beginner to creating a final image. And this image, I believe, will be complicated in some parts, but anyone learning 3D who's brand new to 3D, there's always going to be some concepts that they need to get their head around to fully understand how things work. And I fully appreciate that people who are doing this their first time may not fully understand why they're doing what they're doing, but if they follow all of my steps, they will be able to create this final image. Then at least they've done it. And at least those steps have gone in their brain somewhere. They might not fully understand why, but at one point it will click and they will be able to do this on their own at some point. So I tried to cover all the basic modifiers that I use all the time, all the basic user interfaces that I use all the time, and just try to give them a basic introduction of what all these tools do. So once they've completed the course, they can then go on and try to do something else themselves. Then they might find the modifier like, oh, I used that modifier in that last course I did. And then the more they use it, the more they'll fully understand why they did it and how they modeled a thing that way and why and everything like that. So in this course, I'll go from the absolute basic beginners. I teach you lighting, materials, basic modeling techniques, modifiers, introduction to geometry nodes, and final render settings. And in the end, you end up with a picture like this. So this is my first absolute beginner guide, and I would appreciate some feedback so that I can go back and take note, and then I can create maybe more of these, because I'm always trying to improve my teaching skills, and I am used to teaching people and assuming they know what they're doing, so I do worry if towards the end I'm kind of assuming you know what you're doing by that point. So I do apologize if I do start getting too fast, but just let me know and I'll try to fix that in the future. Not only that, do reach out to us on Discord or write in the comments to any questions you may have, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. But in general, just try to enjoy it, just try to watch it, and just try to learn something new. Even if you are an intermediate or advanced, maybe you can still watch it and maybe you'll learn something new anyway. So maybe it's worth watching. So thank you very much. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing your renders online. Remember to put them on Instagram with, for example, hashtag iMesh, and then I can reshare them on our iMesh page as well. Okay, let's just get straight into it. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is download Blender. And there's a few things that you need to know about the Blender and its versions. I think this might be quite useful to understand before you get started, because there are many different versions of Blender and it's constantly being updated. So I'm just going to explain overall the process and how it works so you can get an understanding of what you should probably download. So Blender is a leading open source 3D creation software used by designers, artists and professionals worldwide. So it's constantly being developed and improved by a team of dedicated developers and contributors worldwide who release new versions of the software on a very regular basis. The reason why there are multiple versions is because that each new version brings new features, improvements, and lots of bug fixes and performance optimizations. So these updates are designed to make the software more powerful, efficient, and easy to use. If we go to the Blender website at blender.org, we will immediately be presented by the latest stable version of Blender. This one will be the right one to download. Just make sure to double check the URL actually says blender.org, and make sure you're not downloading one from a dodgy website. Sometimes if you type into Google Blender download, you might not be taken to the blender.org website and it might be a copy website, so that's just something to double check. If we look here, we can see that there are versions which are also called long-term support, or LTS. This is the most stable version of Blender, and it is often used by production companies, as this is the version of Blender which will provide critical fixes throughout a 2-year span. This LTS version does not include any of the very latest features and changes. It is simply a very stable version ready for production. So if you regularly work on huge projects and a huge team, it is recommended to use the LTS version because that is by far the most stable version. If we look here, we can see that there is a button called Build, and suddenly we see a bunch of different versions of Blender. This is where Blender creates new tools and features where users can test them out before they are released by Blender as the next stable version. So if you find yourself watching a video online and the video is showing a feature that your version doesn't have, then there is a good chance that they have downloaded the most recent build of Blender. There are versions which are inherently unstable, and it's advisable to only use these for fun and to test new features. So don't start a brand new huge project for a client using one of these very latest versions, because there is a good chance you'll hit lots of bugs and it'll make your production far more inefficient. So which version should we get? So I'd recommend downloading the version immediately on the homepage. This is the version that Blender is most confident with and will have some of the latest stable features. And for this course, we'll be using Blender 4.0. Now on the website, you might see 4.0.1, 4.0.2, 4.0.3. You might even see 4.1.1, 4.2.2. Now in general, all the biggest changes that come to Blender are with the first number, so Blender 2, Blender 3, Blender 4, and we've recently moved to the next latest version, which is Blender 4.0. Now I must admit that the UI hasn't changed too much from Blender 3 to 4. So for this course, if you're using Blender 4 onwards, by the time you're watching this, maybe you're even watching this at Blender 5. In general, the user interface will be very, very similar. And because this course will be covering the absolute basics, generally the buttons will still be in the same place, and it'll be more of the new complex things or the new features that come to Blender, which will be the bits which we won't really cover in this course anyway. So just go to Blender, download the latest version. If you do hit any problems and you really cannot find that there is a button which I used in this course which you just cannot find, then just get in touch and we'll be able to push you in the right direction. But in general, for this course, you're not going to have any issues trying to find the locations of certain buttons. As Blender gets developed more and more and more, it is getting tightened and tightened to the point where it's becoming a perfect piece of software with a perfect layout where everyone feels most comfortable. So let's go to the homepage, download Blender. It is a simple executable file and it's about 300 megabytes, and you'll be able to install that on your computer. And then once that's installed, just open it and let's get started. Okay, welcome to your Blender journey. So this is where we're going to start. This is the splash screen. So Blender's just opened and you'll be presented with something like this. This picture might be a slightly bit different every time you load, and every time there's a new version of Blender, they add a new picture here. So this is the latest version that I'm using now, and it'll be displayed here. And here will show you a few recent files and a few other buttons that you can press if you need to at some point. But I don't need to use any of these, and I can just click off of here. If you want to get it back, you can click the splash screen button here and bring that back. But generally you don't need to. If you realize you need to open an old project, you just go to File, Open Recent, and just click on the recent file you want there. Right, and what we have here are a few separate windows. We have a timeline, we have a 3D viewport, we have an outlier, we have properties, we have several different things. And I'm going to try to talk you through all of them so you can get an understanding of where everything is, how you can navigate around the scene, just so it doesn't seem so daunting, because I know it can be very daunting at first, and there's a little bit of a learning curve. I'll try to make that as smooth as possible. So this right here is the 3D viewport. This is where most of the magic happens. You have the lighting, your objects, your cameras, and this is where you can edit your objects and move things around and everything like that. So I'll talk you through everything here, then we can jump straight into the project and start creating some pretty pictures. So over here we have the toolbar, which can be opened with the T key. You have to remember that your mouse needs to be in this window to open that menu. If it's over here, nothing will happen. So it needs to be in this window. That's the same as a few other shortcut keys. If I press G, I can move that around. But if I press G, nothing's going to happen over there. So you remember where your mouse is important. I can also press the N key and bring up another menu here. So both of these menus have a few different tools and a few different purposes. So several plugins will go down here and a few other things. So let's just hide these here. And then what we have up here is the outlier. So this basically gives you a hierarchical view of all the objects in the scene, including name, type, and relationships. So this is an object, this is a camera, and this is light. And you can basically go through these all, and anything you select here will also be selected over here. To select anything, you just left click with your mouse, and that will be selected. If you want to select multiple things, you can click on one, hold down Shift, and then click on the other ones. And you'll notice that when you select them, they do have an orange outline around them, but the last one that you select, the main one that you select, will always have a light orange outline, almost like a yellow outline, and the other ones will be more orangey. That's to tell you that that is the last one selected, and any settings that you do change over here, for example, will be reflecting the last selected object. So now it will be reflecting a lamp, now it will be reflecting a default object. So that's this outlier here. And this is the object properties panel. So this is basically going to give you render settings, output settings, world settings, and settings related to those objects like I just mentioned. So you can change the lighting value here. You can change some of the camera settings here. And this is the 3D viewport. So the 3D viewport is where you're going to create all of your scenes, you'll edit all your objects, you can set up the camera to where you want it to be, and you can test to see how it's going to look in the final render and everything like that. So this is the most fun part for sure. So let's learn how to navigate around here. So if we want to rotate, we're going to rotate with a middle mouse wheel. So we'll click and drag. You might notice if you have a laptop, you may not have a middle mouse wheel. Now I do highly recommend that you get a mouse with a middle mouse wheel, because that is super important inside of Blender. But if you do not have one, you can go to Edit, then Preferences, then you can click on Input, and then you can click emulate 3-button mouse. So instead of clicking the middle mouse wheel, you can click this, and then if you hold down shift and then left mouse button, it will emulate the middle mouse wheel. But we do have a mouse right now, so I'm just going to turn that back off. Anything you do change, click save preferences, or if this button isn't here, just click save preferences there, and then you can just close this. So we can rotate around the object here, and if we hold down shift, then click the middle mouse wheel, we can pan and move around. And then we can also use the middle mouse wheel to scroll in and out, and we can scroll into the object. Now this can be a little bit funny because let's say you rotate around and suddenly you want to zoom into this camera. You find that you can't really zoom into the camera for some reason. No matter how far you go, you just can't reach it. Now the way to imagine this is that your 3D viewport has an imaginary center point. So if I move that over here, the center point is going to be around here. And if I move around, you can see that the box is in the center here, but if I move to the left, it's no longer in the center. So anything you want to rotate around or zoom into, you need to make sure that object is in the very center of the screen. Just like this lamp. Let's say we want to zoom into this lamp. I'm going to hold down shift, I'm going to pan with the mouse wheel, and I'm going to get it roughly into the center of the screen. I'm going to rotate around. I can see it's no longer in the center, so let's move it back into the center. And now it's dead center, so I can zoom in and scroll as close to it as I want to. So let's do the same thing back with the box. Let's go back to here. And let's make it back into the center. So move it around something like this. Then we can zoom in as much as we like. Get around that object. And the same thing for this camera over here. Let's move it into the center. Let's move it over here. And there we go. We can now zoom into this as much as we like. Now there are other buttons we can press to make it to the center, because sometimes it can be really annoying. So there's something really far away to get over to there, to move it all around so it is in the center point. It can be a little bit finicky. There is some buttons you can press to make it a bit quicker. So let's click on this camera. Let's click the point button on the number pad. And there we go. We're now centered around the object. There we go. We are centered around the object too. And this one here. Now if you don't have a number pad, you can go to View and Frame Selected. So View, View, Frame Selected. And let's say we're super lost, we've ended up over here, we don't know where we are, we could go View, Frame All, and it'll bring us right back to the center and try to get everything in the scene together. So that's basically moving around the scene. If we do want to select everything, I just did it, so I might as well show you. You can click and drag, and you can select everything in the scene like that. Or you can press A to select all, or we can press T to bring up this menu. We can click and hold onto this one, and we can choose other selection methods, such as lasso tool. I've never actually used this, I don't think. Actually, in very select cases I have used it, but I do like to just leave it on this one by default. There we go. So now we can move around the scene. We can look around at separate objects. We can click on them all. We can select them all. And now let's have a look at this button here. So this is the 3D cursor, which is super useful inside of Blender. And that is basically this crosshairs there. So to move it to any point, you hold down Shift and right click. You can move it anywhere in the scene. If you move it over here, it's trying to guess where in 3D space you want it to go. So put it over here. It's going to try to guess. But if I click on an object, it's going to attach it to that object. And that can be very useful for certain situations. I can also, if I go into edit mode, which I'll show you in a second, I can also make sure the cursor is exactly at that point. Now this is useful for various different reasons, because right now in every single object there's a little point. If I rotate this one, it will rotate around that point. Same as the camera, it will rotate around that orange point. But I can use the 3D cursor to pivot around that point instead. So here I'm adjusting the pivot point. So previously it was on the median point, but now I'm going to say no, I want it to rotate around the 3D cursor. So the 3D cursor is very useful for various different reasons. I can also use it to tell it other objects to go to that point. So I can click on this one, do Shift S, and do selection to cursor. Now that light is over at that point as well. So that's just good to know. We'll cover that probably in a bit more detail a little bit later, but that's all the information you need to know. Right, now we're getting on to moving objects and stuff like that. Let's set this back to median point. Moving, rotating, scaling, and all the above. So this gizmo does allow you to do that by hand, like this. But I will advise you to get away from using these gizmos as quickly as possible, because there is a shortcut key which is more useful. So we can press G to basically grab, we can R to rotate, and S to scale. So using all of these is going to be so much more useful than trying to find the button, click it, drag it, and then rotate. Using those shortcut keys is going to be so much quicker, but it's good to know that's there, especially when you're starting out. So let's try grabbing. So we can grab, no matter where our mouse is, we can always grab it. So we don't need to go over to the object and move it. We can just do this, drag it around. We can also drag it and move it on a set axis. So we can do G, X, and then we can move it on that axis. We press G and then Y, when it moves it on that axis. Then we can press Z, move it on that axis. And the green one refers to the Y, the X refers to the X, and the Z is a hidden blue one. If you do want to see it, you can go over to here and turn that on there, but we don't really need that one. It's also reflected here, so we can view all these here. So we can move it, we can rotate it also on the X-axis, Y-axis, and Z-axis, and we can also do the same thing, scale it on the Z, X, and Y. But not only that, we can also move it, rotate it, and scale it on set increments. So in Blender, generally each box refers to 1 meter. So if I was to do G, Y, then 1, it's going to move it 1 meter. G, Y, 2 meters. And then I left click to confirm that, then it's there. I can do G, Y, minus 2 meters, and it's gone back to where it was. I can also rotate it, but rotating 2 meters doesn't really make sense when you're rotating. In rotating, which you'll be able to see up here, some information, we see it's in degrees. So to rotate 360 degrees, it's going to go back to where it was. So if I was to do GX and then type in 20, it's going to rotate it 20 degrees. If I was to do backspace, because in the top left corner, it's basically you're typing the number. If I was to type 45, then press enter, it's then done that by a set amount of increments as well. I can also do the same thing with scaling. So I could do SX, but instead of meters or degrees, it's going to be a multiplier. So let's say this is 1 meter wide. I do SX2, it's going to scale that by 2. So if I go over to here, I can press the N menu. This gives us all the information about the object. We can see that this is now scaled by 2 to 4 meters. Okay, so it was already 2 meters. So if I was to do SX.5, it's gone straight back from 4 meters to 2 meters because you're multiplying this by 0.5, which brings it, SX.5, which brings it back to 2. Now, you don't need to know exactly right now, but if you do scale objects, you do see that there is also another number here. That is like Blender has remembered its original state, and it's saying it is now multiplying the X value by 2. So anything you do inside of this, it will be multiplying that on the X-axis by 2. So this is basically called a bevel, which I'll cover a little bit later. But you can see that it's beveling on this axis more than this because it's remembered its original state. But if I was then to scale this on the X-axis by 0.5 to bring that back to 1, we can see that that bevel now looks even on every side. So if you want to do some object changes, sometimes it's important for these values to be 1, but you don't want to scale this back. Let's say this is the final shape you want. You want to apply that. So you want to do Control A, you can apply the scale. Now that's set back to 1. Now if I go back into here and was just to bevel it, we can see that's a much more uniform bevel than it was before, because it's now saying, okay, this is the final state of this object. I don't need to remember its original settings. And that's the same with rotation. So let's say this is the final object, degrees. It says that it thinks that it's 90 degrees rotated, which in some cases can cause some problems. So you just need to remember sometimes if something's not quite right, working on the right axis for some reason, you want to do Control A and apply the rotation. And now that's saying, okay, that is the base state of this object. So anything we do from now on will remember this state. Okay, now while we're here, you did see that I did actually start changing these vertices. So how did I do that? Over here, you can see that we are in object mode. So if I was to duplicate this object with Shift D, so you select the object, Shift D on the Y axis, we can see got 2. We can see that I'm in object mode, so anything I do, I can select each object individually, and I can't really change any of the objects. So now let's say I want to delete this object, I can press the delete key, or I can go over to here, press the delete key, or I can press X and then delete. Throughout all of my courses, I'm probably going to be pressing X, and that's because in some settings, there is more options when I press X, and delete isn't the only thing I want to do. Maybe there's something else I want to do. So I'm just very used to pressing X first, then pressing delete. It's just part of my workflow, so that's what I'm used to. So if you want to press delete, you can also do that. So how did I edit this object? I went over to here and pressed edit mode. There's also a tab key to tab in and out, and now I can change that. So over here, I can click on all the vertices. These are vertices, and each one is called a vertex. I can select each one independently, and I can do the same thing. I can press G, I can press R or S. But you can see when I press R or S, nothing's happening because these are singular points. These have no dimension by themselves, but they help build space. So if I was to do S now with 2 selected, it scales it from each independent point. And if I was to rotate, I can rotate it, but I can't scale it on the Y-axis because there's no dimension here. There's a this is now an edge with no dimension on these points. If I was to scale it on the y-axis, there's nothing to go. But if I was to select these, I can now scale this on the y-axis, but I can't scale this on the z-axis because we have the same problem, but I can select these faces here and scale this down if I wanted to. Now, anything you do inside of here, if I was to scale this by 2, then come out, you'll see that the numbers remember the object settings as 111, even though I've scaled it. And that's because I'm inside the objects, so anything I do inside of here is set in stone, and Blender doesn't remember these settings. These are referring to the object settings and not inside the edit mode. That's just a little caveat. You'll learn that over time. It's just useful to know that that is how it works. It might just be useful at some point. So we can scale this down. We can also select the edges on their own. So we can go over to here, click Edge Select. We can select all the edges. We can do the same thing. Click, rotate, scale, and we can also do the same thing clicking on face select. So we can select any faces, we can scale them. If you want to select multiple at once, hold down shift key to select all of them, and we can scale them in like that. There we go. Now, there is a shortcut key for this, of course. We can press 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3. And I just quickly switch between the ones that we want to change. So I can select these two, and then I want to select this face, we can do that. Now over here, you'll also notice that lots more tools have become available. So if I select this face, I can then press this button to extrude, and I get a new tool, which allows me to extrude. I can also press this button here to inset the face, or there's also this button here, which I can also then bevel the face. I can use the middle mouse wheel to increase the number of segments. But like before, there's also shortcut keys for this as well. If you hover over this, it will tell you that's the E key in the bottom right. This one is the I key, and this one is the Control B key. And that's what I'll also be using throughout this project. So if I press E, I can extrude, I to inset. I can then select this edge and I can bevel that. I can select all of them, I can bevel them like this. I can smooth it out like that. And you can see how you can very quickly turn one shape into another shape by using these tools. Now there are a lot of tools, and of course you're probably not going to learn all of them straight away. I think that as you work through Blender and start giving yourself several different projects, you will learn this over time and you'll be able to make more and more complicated things. Right then, so now let's add a very simple object like a mesh UV sphere. So let's say that I want to smooth this out. I can do right click and I can do shade smooth, but you can see that this now has a very smooth surface because Blender's basically averaged out all of the face angles, but you can see at the edges it is a lot more jagged. So when we added the sphere, we did see there was also more settings here. So down here is a little drop down, click this and we can change the settings. So we can increase this and we can increase this, which is getting smoother and smoother. And we can set this to 128. Set this to 64, it's getting smoother and smoother, but it's still not getting 100% smooth at the edges. But if we get closer and closer and closer, we can see it's not smooth. And if we click off of it, we can no longer go back. But we can press F9 to bring back our last operation. We can change it here. But let's say we go into this object, go back, F9 no longer works. So this object is this smooth, but it's still not smooth enough. Like, what can we do to smooth this out? So we don't need to add an object with this much geometry to start with, because if you imagine, the more geometry you have, the more information Blender needs to load to figure out how to move around the scene. And if you end up with millions and millions and millions of these little faces, it can slow things down. So generally you want to start with objects and make it generally quite low, something like this, and then you can shade smooth, and then there's something else we can do to change the number of faces on this object. We could go over to these Modifiers tab, and this allows us to basically undestructively edit the object. Because if we were to, for example, added 128 faces by 64, which was really, really heavy, we can no longer go back and change that. But if I was to go over to here, add a modifier, generate, subdivision surface, this has now already smoothed this out. I can do it again. We can see at the edges, it's smoothing out these edges here. So if I go back, this is it with it turned off, turned on, and then even more detail. We can see it smooths out lots and lots and lots. Now, my first mistake when I started Blender was I had this shade flat and I found subdivision surface and I just tried to increase lots and lots and lots, and now this looks smooth. But if I go to here and turn on statistics, there are now 2 million faces from the original 512. So it's very quick to add detail, and that can start slowing down Blender quite considerably. You can see how slow that is to enable. It's like a little bit of a lag when you turn it on, and that's because it's trying to load in all these faces. So generally, you want to set this something quite low. Something like 1 should be enough, and then we do right click, shade smooth, And there we go. That should be all the information we need. And that basically smooths out the edge just enough that this looks like a smooth sphere. But we'll also see there's two settings here. And this is how most things are going to happen inside a Blender. There's going to be a viewport setting and there's going to be a render setting. So over here in the outlier, there's also these buttons here. This means viewport, and then this means render setting. So if I turn this off, it's not visible in the viewport, but it is visible in the render. So if I was to go into the camera, if I was to turn this off in the viewport and press render, we can see it's still there. And the same thing for here. If I was to turn this off in the viewport, let's just unhide that, scale that up a bit, shade flat. So if I was to if I set this to 0 here and render it, we can see it looks just like in the viewport. But if I turn this up in the render view to 3, we can see this looks smoother, like it's got different settings for the viewport. So if you ever render an object and it's hidden from the viewport, which is also H on the keyboard, and then you suddenly render it and you think, oh my god, where has that sphere come from? It's nowhere here. That's because it's hidden from the viewport. And the same thing can be said for, you can hide it in the render. So you can turn this off here. When you render it, it's no longer going to be there. So most things inside of Blender are going to have two settings, one for the viewport and one for the render setting. And that's mostly because, imagine you set this to 6, you've got loads of these objects turned off like this. Your viewport, with all of these, if all of these were turned on, that's going to be a considerable amount of data that Blender's going to need to load every single time. And the viewport will start lagging and start being really, really slow, especially if you've got a slow computer. So it's useful that some settings will only be visible when you're ready to finally say, okay, I'm ready, start the hard work computer, try not to set on fire, and render my project. Okay, and then lastly in the 3D viewport, there's also something called viewport shading. So you can enable wireframe, solid view, material view, or rendered view. Now rendered view will be the most accurate one. It will render it with the highest settings, and that is the one which is the slowest method. The material preview will try to do a really good estimate of what the material will look like in the final render. This is really pretty fast, but it's not going to be a 100% accurate representation of what it's going to look like in the render view. This is the solid view, and the wire view is there. The wireframe view is if you're in edit mode. It's really easy to see inside your object, so you can select stuff on the other side. Whereas in solid view you can't, you can only select what's on front. And it's really easy to switch between them. If you press Z, you get a thing called a pie menu. When you move your mouse over, you can click wireframe, solid view, render view, or material view. So I generally find myself just really quickly switching between them. I don't even think about it now. It's just so quick, you just quickly flick and quick, click and flick, and there we go. So I think that's enough for the 3D viewport. Let's go over to here. So over here we just generally have general settings that you might need. Edit preferences, which you can add, like you can add your own add-ons, which I'm not going to cover in this tutorial, and a few other interface settings like this. I've generally increased this a little bit so you can actually see what I'm doing, but this depends on your own monitor size. You can also render your images, a few other things, and there's also a few default layouts over here. So you can switch between pre-made layouts, which are made specifically for certain things, so you can change the animations and stuff like this. But we can also create our own layouts. So let's say that we start Blender and we do the same thing every single time. So every time we start, we select everything with A and then delete it. Every time we delete everything and then we start working. We can actually do that and then go to File, Default, and click Save Startup File. And if you click that, it will save this, and when you close Blender and come back, it will load exactly how it looks here. So you can add any objects to the scene, cubes, spheres, everything. Go to defaults, save startup file, and then every time you load it, it will load all of those things in for you. But what I do want to do, I want to create a new window here so I can edit some other things later on, because what I do also do a lot, which you'll do, is every single object will generally have a material. So I want to open the shading tab so I can change the materials very easily for all objects while also having the 3D viewport available. So if you go over to here, to every single corner of every single panel, a little kind of crosshairs appears, and that is telling you that something is available. So if I click and drag, a new window has appeared. Now this can be a little bit fiddly to start with, but if I want to close this, I go to this one, click and drag over here, and then I can close it. I can also right click over here, right click and click vertical split, and I can do it that way. Some people find it easier to do it that way, but I'm just very used to old Blender, just quickly doing it like this. And if you do find yourself with a complete mess, like something like this, which I see quite a lot on Blender Reddit, something like this, you think, oh my god, I just keep getting more and more and more. you just click on one side, click on hold and drag, and then you can just tell it which side to delete and do something like that. Or you can right click and click join area, and that's the same thing. Maybe right clicking, maybe this is a bit easier to start with. So let's just join area over here. There we go. So what we have in the top left corner of each single panel is an option to change which one this should be. So even this one is the properties editor. I can click over here and click 3D viewport. So now anything I do over here is going to be here, here, and here. But generally most people keep this as the properties panel because that's where it generally always is. This is always going to be the outliner. You can also change it to anything you want. And then this one, like I said, I want this to be the shader editor. So I'm going to go over to here and click shader editor, and then that's going to change. So this is going to be nothing here until I add a material to this object. So I click on this object, I click new, and then we get some settings here. I'm not going to cover this material panel right now, but basically this information here is reflecting what's over here, but this is a node viewer. So anything I add over here, I can see it from left to right. So this is the output, these are the inputs going into the output, and all the information here is also, it's just in a long list, which can be very hard to view. So the node viewer basically makes it a lot easier to build really complicated node setups, and it's actually very intuitive once you get to know it. But when we start our actual project, I'll start creating the first materials, and then we can start to see how this goes together. But generally when I start Blender, I have the shader editor, I have the 3D viewport, and that's basically how I start. So I would just go to File, Defaults, Save Startup File, and then we're ready to go. Actually, there's actually one more thing I always change, and that is the render settings. Under Render Engine, I will switch from Eevee to Cycles. Eevee is basically a real-time render engine, which means that it will try to render as quickly as possible so you can move in real time around your scene while it being rendered. Whereas Cycles is a path tracer, which basically means that there's going to be millions and millions of rays shot into the scene, just like photons of light in real life, millions and millions into the scene, and it will calculate all the light bounces and try to figure out what the material is that it's bouncing the light off of, and then it can kind of calculate it. I think that is basically magic how they've managed to make this work, but it works, and I will always be using Cycles. Then under Device, I'll try to use GPU. If your GPU is grayed out, go to Edit and Preferences and go to System, and you want to choose one of these. CUDA is for like old GPUs, I believe old NVIDIA ones. Optics will be using RTX cards. HIP is for AMD. Open API is for integrated, those new Intel built-in GPUs, and I believe there's another one for Apple PCs called Metal, but it might be worth doing a check. If you have an Apple PC, which one will work best? You don't necessarily need it. You can use the CPU, but it's a lot slower. Blender is hugely benefits from using GPU, so I'll just set that to GPU and optics because I got 3070. So save preferences, and we'll close. So these are the settings here, and then generally then I would go to default save startup file, and there we go. So I think that we are ready to start the actual project now. I think we've covered all the absolute basics. We can move objects around and kind of work our way around the scene. So let's start the actual project now.